Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of Galileo at 400, looking through 21st century telescopes. I'm James P. Barbieri, program coordinator here at the Paris Center, and I will be your host and a reader translator for today. As a host, I'm here to help you throughout the call, so any issues, let me know in the chat or let Eleanor or Michael know. Before I begin, just very briefly, if you can just make sure your microphone is muted. We do invite you all to have your cameras on, as it's always great to see everyone's faces. The chat is open, so feel free to share your thoughts and ideas with the rest of the group. And of course, this session is recorded for archival purposes, and you should all receive the recording link in a few days. So for the next 3 sessions, we will be celebrating the 400th anniversary of Galileo's publication, the Assayer, or Il Saggiatore, where we will be revisiting the book and exploring it through the lens of the 21st century. Today we have Àlex Gómez-Marín and myself, where we will be reading some excerpts of the original text, translate it, and discuss its understanding, meaning, and legacy. So you all know Àlex. He is a Spanish physicist turned neuroscientist and the director of the Paris Center. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics and a master's in biophysics from the University of Barcelona. Since 2016, he's been the head of the Behavior of Organisms Laboratory at the Instituto de Neurociencia in Alicante, where he is an associate professor of the Spanish research. And with that, I'll hand it over to you. Hi, Àlex.
Thank you, James. And nothing of what you just read about my bio qualifies me as a historian of science or a philosopher of science, but today I'll pretend I'm one, and we can pretend together, because it's really important to look at science not only as what the latest edition of the textbook says, or what the latest article in a scientific journal says, but also what was said and who said it and how it was said. And today, as James just said, we're celebrating a really important piece. We'll talk about it at length today. So I wanted to make this first comment about the importance to educate ourselves in the history and philosophy of science, but actually by actually going and reading those texts, and we can all do it. Second, this is a celebration, and we need anniversaries as good excuses to celebrate stuff. And this is one. And it allows us to go back to Galileo and go back to the future. So the back to the future will be taking place, I suppose, more on the second part of this series and the third one. And today will be its necessary step to actually talk about what Galileo said. So that's what we will be doing today. A third point is on books, on people not reading books so much today, I suppose, reading a lot of WhatsApp and social media, not reading books, and maybe not reading a lot of books about science, and even less reading books about scientists who are dead, and who are dead for 400 years. You know, why bother? But I insist, this is really a celebration, and this is also preparation for the other 2 parts, and this is also an invitation to read. And for that, I've copied in the chat, and it was also in the announcement, and it's in the website of the Paris Center. I've copied first the abridged English translation by Drake, second, the original Galileo book, the Assayer, Il Saggiatore, for those who can read Italian, and third, a review I recently published in Science Magazine, actually last week, apropos of this anniversary. So there you'll have the material. And well, if that was a kind of a more regular classroom and I could see you all, I'll ask you, well, please raise your hand if you have read something about Galileo. Have you had the chance, the wheel, the excuse, the moment to just double click on the Drake translation, which is really short, like printed. I'll be showing you my, printed is like this. Nothing. It's really nothing. It's 26 pages times 2. The original one is this, and we'll talk about that. Quite a lengthy manner. There's a lot of, if I may dare to say, a lot of clutter here, but also some jewels, right? So this is the Italian. So the Italian is really long, but this is really worth reading. You can do it perhaps in a couple of hours. So if you haven't, don't worry. We'll read some parts today, and I encourage you to then read it. And for that, we'll go from the English, and then in some quotes that are really, really important and special and beautiful and foundational for science, I'll ask James to read the Italian version so we can hear also the words, not just read them. And also I'll ask James to give us his own translation to English, and we'll discuss them. So that's what we will do. Okay, why Galileo today? Galileo at 400 doesn't mean that he was born 400 years ago. It means that it was 400 years ago, and it's literally 400 years ago because he published Il Saggiatore, the Assayer, in October of 1623. So it's 400 years ago, and it's even more exciting to realize that, well, so here I printed a little bit of the original, and, you know, there's this beautiful frontispiece, and then there's some poems in there, and there's this letter to the Pope, right? Today we write the letter to the editor of the journal, but before you wrote to the Pope in that case, and we'll talk about it later probably, but I want you to see the date. So it was written on the 20th of October of 1623. And I found that just astounding because today is the 20th of October of 2023. Okay, so we're celebrating the 400th anniversary of this book. Galileo published many books before and a few after this book, which we won't cover. Maybe we can say something about the other contributions of Galileo. If I remember, I'll read something I've written about it, summarizing more about his contributions to mechanics and so on. But this one is particularly important because it has two of the most famous quotes, at least, and we'll go into them in a minute, the quote about nature being a book written in a certain language, which is the language of mathematics, and only if you know that language you can decipher the secrets, right? That's in this book. And the third important contribution in this book is the articulation, and it wasn't meant, that wasn't like a treatise on epistemology or how you do science. It was addressing another matter, which is that there had been some comets seen in Europe in 1618, 3 comets, and then they were debating what are those. So here Galileo is rebutting somebody else's critique of his own thoughts about that matter. But in doing that, he makes this claim about mathematics that has influenced physics and therefore science for 400 years. He makes another quote about, several quotes about the method, observation, not appeal to authority, not being dogmatic, which is understood as a bedrock of the scientific method, as we call it today. And then another one about consciousness. And they're more like, these are the 3 big diamonds, right? And then there are more lovely quotes. So that's what we're celebrating, that he published this book 400 years ago. So today is part 1, as I was saying, with James. Part 2 is going to be with Avi Loeb and Dean Radin, and there we're going to be using the metaphor of looking through telescopes. There's quite a deal, of course, about the importance of a telescope here in looking through it and assessing the nature of these comets. But the idea of the telescope, or 21st century telescopes, is that, well, today we may be in a similar situation where we are looking at the inner space, and that's what Avi Loeb has been championing for the last years, or to inner spaces of the mind. That's what Dean Radin has been championing. So that'll be part 2. We'll have a conversation, the 3 of us, mainly them, and I'll be chairing it. And then on part 3, we'll invite some relevant figures from the Galileo Commission of the Scientific and Medical Network, David Lorimer, Athena Potari, and Marjorie Woolacott. And we'll talk about what the Galileo Commission is about, which is expanding the scope, telescope, expanding the scope of science towards what they call, we can call it differently, a post-materialist world view. Okay, so today, let's go for today. I'll speak, I love speaking, as you know. I'll speak for 45 minutes, maybe, so that we have 30 minutes to open it up. I prefer not to be interrupted, but at the same time, I love it. So if there's really a question or a comment, a critique, something, you can put it on the chat, and maybe James can warn me if I don't realize. But I'll try to just give you kind of the whole thing, and then we'll open it up to discuss what these quotes mean then and today. Okay, so 2 more things. One is I want to thank John Pickering, because it was last month, beginning of last month, when he was presenting at our Science, Art, and the Sacred in-person event, that he was talking about different scientists. And there he mentioned the Assayer, and he wrote, well, a few quotes and wrote 1623. And then I realized, fuck, 400 years. And it's like, okay, I must use this as an opportunity. So that presentation by John was what kind of prompted me to write this piece for Science and to actually propose this series. So it all has unfolded from it. And also I want to thank Francesco Elia, who also was there in the meeting. He's a philosopher of mind and a scientist, a neuroscientist interested in consciousness. And with him, I had discussed the Galileo's Assayer in relationship to consciousness studies a few months ago. So these both men, in a way, brought to my attention this really foundational text. Good. So you're still with me? Good. What I'll do now, and it sounds like advertisement, self-promotion. I'll read, it's just one page. I'll read my piece, my review of Galileo, published last week, as I was telling you, because I can do it in 4.5 minutes. And this gives you the whole summary of what we're going to talk about today. We will unpack it later with James. So if you only have 4.5 minutes and you don't want to read it, I'll read it for you. Okay, so here we go. Galileo's Comet Rebuttal, a foundational text that articulated the modern scientific method, turns 400. This October marks the 400th anniversary of the publication of the Assayer, Il Saggiatore, in Italian, by Galileo Galileo, 1564-1642, a treatise intended to address a major controversy on the nature of 3 comets observed in Europe in 1618. The book came to represent a major landmark in the history of science. Contained in Galileo's discussion of, quote, science as a method of demonstration and reasoning capable of human pursuit, is an articulation of the scientific method as we now know it. Some have, quote, advanced ridiculous and impossible opinions against me, end quote, writes Galileo, dramatically in the book's opening, referring specifically to criticisms leveraged by the Jesuit priest and mathematician Orazio Grassi. Writing under the pseudonym Sarsi, in 1619, Grassi had published Libra Astronomica ac Philosophica, which sought to refute Galileo's claim that the comets could be visual illusions rather than celestial bodies. Grassi was later proven right. Thus, quote, forced to act by this unexpected and uncalled for treatment, end quote, Galileo continues, I break my previous resolve to publish no more. And here you can start to see kind of the rhetoric tone of the book, if you haven't opened it yet. The Assayer was written as a letter to Virginio Cesari, an Italian poet and chamberlain of the Pope Gregory XV, and his successor, the Pope Urban VIII, which actually one had died. I think one died in August, and then the other one took office. And Galileo published this in October, so it was a transition between popes. To whom this Pope Urban VIII, to whom Galileo dedicated the book. That's precisely the letter I was showing you before. All right. And under whose pontificate the astronomer was trialed 10 years later. Maybe we can unpack this a bit, this part of the history later, because it's not that El Saggiatore triggered the punishment. It was another book that he wrote a few years later, and well, he was sentenced to not to death, not to the stake, but to prison, and then quickly commuted to house arrest. And Galileo spent at least 10 more years. 10 last years of his life in house arrest because of that. So it's not a joke, but he was in good terms, apparently, with this Pope. It contains, among other prescient observations, a revelatory passage about the mathematical intelligibility of nature. Okay, so this is really the first highlight. And this is the quote: philosophy is written in this grand book, the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze, Galileo writes. He continues, but the book cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which it is composed. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without this, one wanders about in a dark labyrinth. Right? just to mention that not so many scientists know mathematics today, but I leave that aside for discussion. It's interesting. Also, and we'll discuss this later perhaps, this image of a book that has to be deciphered has been interestingly changing, because when the biologists, especially molecular biologists, took over the study of life last century, they said, no, it's not written. The secret of life, maybe the secret of matter and energy is written in math, but the secret of life is written in a DNA code. So we're going to sequence stuff, and that's how we're going to read, what human beings are. It turned out that's not that simple, of course. And neuroscientists do the same. It's not really in math, it's in some sort of Morse code in the spikes, in the action potentials of the brain. And other scientists today, physicists, don't even talk about mathematics, they talk about computation like Wolfram. So this idea of different languages giving you different keys, you see, and you could even think about the Bible, for instance, right? Well, the Bible is another book where you can find cosmic secrets, right? Okay, I should not gloss too much this, because otherwise it's going to be longer. That's highlight number one, mathematics. The number two is this one. Galileo proceeds to brilliantly expound the primacy of empirical observations, which, coupled with precise mathematical definitions, can offer testable predictions to decide what to believe in our quest for truth. One must, however, be aware of mischaracterizing him, as Galileo was not advocating for a cold and detached science. He was mindful of the limits of sense and reasoning, and supplemented his great abstraction and observation skills with intuition and imagination. Okay, we'll see more about the method, the empirical method. Third highlight comes here. And we'll go in order, because I'll start telling you kind of the Twitter-like, soap opera-like complaints about, okay, now I need to write this book because everybody's straw-manning my previous work. That's how the book starts. Then quite early, we find the quote about mathematics. Then a big chunk is about the comet, where it is close to the sun, how can we make sure, what about the heat, what about the light? This is perhaps the least important aspect we will discuss today, but it's what this book is about. And then towards the end, really the last pages, he drops again this diamond, right? So influential. So Galileo stamped another indelible idea in the Assayer, one with consequences for the study of mind and matter that have percolated throughout the centuries and continue to affect 21st century consciousness studies. Towards the end of the book, he writes, without the senses as our guides, reason or imagination unaided would probably never arrive at qualities like these. Hence, I think that tastes, odors, colors, and so on are no more than mere names, so far as the object in which we place them is concerned, and that they reside only in consciousness. And then Galileo contrasts, quote, primary phenomena of motion and touch with sensations, which he regards as secondary quality with no real existence save in us. Again, this needs to be unpacked, but this is the third jewel here, because basically what he's saying, and arguably for the first time, I was asking a philosopher friend of mine, because then we have other philosophers that come later, and they come later and say, yes, primary qualities, secondary qualities. But this is one of the first, perhaps the first time somebody wrote, well, in the world, there are kind of things that travel in first class and things that travel in second class. And the things that travel in first class are kind of the geometric, mathematical, objective stuff, velocity, shape, and so on. And then, well, there's smells, like the subjective stuff. And these, and in a way, Galileo is right, if I die, these go with me, they die with me. So perhaps they're not first class. That's why we call them secondary qualities. But this split is precisely where we are 400 years later. I'm sure this will be discussed in part 2 and part 3, where science programmatically, like strategically, maybe unconsciously because we forgot, but Galileo made this distinction. And therefore we said, okay, so then we're going to study the primary qualities, the real thing, the real deal. And on the other, well, whatever, we put it to the side. And we've put it to the side for 400 years. But now, if we want to do a science of consciousness, and the scientific foundations are found in Galileo and others who explicitly put this to the side, they didn't say that wasn't real. They said, well, that sounds secondary. We're going to do the science with mathematics and observation of these primary qualities. Well, now how do we untangle this knot? So, as I write here, having programmatically excluded subjective experience from the purview of science, we're still struggling to untie the Galilean knot that is the hard problem of consciousness. Then 2 more paragraphs and I'm done. The book is also an example of epistemic humility in the face of dogmatic opinions, appeals to authority, and the profligacy of logical argumentation. Galileo writes, we must resort to experiments for settling such questions. I mean, that looks trivial today, but it wasn't, because before, and this is not a critique on philosophers, and at that time, until very recently, scientists and philosophers were hybridized in the same body, right? But before, in order to discuss matters, as he also mentions here when he discusses Aristotle, for instance, well, you appeal to reasoning, but, well, what about go and test it? Why don't we go and test it? That seems obvious today, but it's Galileo, one of the forerunners of the idea of, well, let's just check it out and let's leave aside all these appeals to authority, which, by the way, is very ironic given the so-called expert scientist, that comes to tell us what we should do because he or she knows. So it's an appeal to an authority who has supposedly done the experimental check. Okay, that's also material for discussion. So Galileo insists, and when it's not possible to settle those questions with experiments, and this is beautiful, we must, quote, suspend our argument and wait quietly until some new comet come along, in this case for the comet. So it's like, if you don't know, shut the fuck up. I mean, just say you don't know. Just say you just need more evidence instead of pontificating what you don't know. So again, that's why it's a call for epistemic humility. Okay, and then finally the piece ends telling people, go and read it. It's easy, it's free, it's there. So the abridged English translation of the Assayer by the late American historian of science, Stillman Drake. And here I can mention already, I had it written down for later, but I knew this would happen. I would read and I could not refrain from saying certain things. The pro version, after you read the Drake translation, or even by the entire original or the entire translation, if you're lucky, for instance, in Spanish, we have it entirely translated. The 2 scholars who I found they're like the world authorities in Galileo are Stillman Drake and Alexander Coiré. So go and read them. And there's so much. And actually, for instance, Alexander Coiré, whom I won't mention much today, he has really even controversial, interesting takes on bless you, interesting takes on whether Galileo actually did certain experiments or not, the role of observation versus how much Galileo was really imagining all of that as, as Gedanken experiments, like what Einstein would do later. So this is like further material, Stillman Drake, Alexander Coiré. Okay, so can be found online, the Drake translation. And this is another thing. I read the Drake translation and I thought, oh, what a cute, small little piece Galileo wrote. And then I wrote the review and I thought about it, I researched it. And then I said, well, let's see if I can find the original. It's like, oh, it's really, really long. So that was surprising. And I can see why Drake did the abridged translation, because really reading all of this in English, it's really tough for the reasons we'll discuss later, because of the style it is written. And the original Italian version is considerably longer, beautifully illustrated, and can be read online too. You have both links here as well. And I finish by saying those who take the time to do so will be rewarded with the insight into the great astronomer's singular character and seminal ideas. Okay, good. How are we doing? You're still there. All right. Now, so level 1 or level 0 is this summary. Level 1 is what we will do now. We'll walk through some of these quotes and others and read them in Italian and comment them. There are more aspects we won't be able to touch. Maybe I'll mention them that are in the Assayer. And then there are more aspects in other books of Galileo that we have no chance of talking about, right? So let me just say this again. Okay, so we'll start. And I decided we would do this in a way chronologically as we come across the things in the piece, right? So the first part here is the style. Academics, we love this kind of futile quarrels on Twitter. And then you read Galileo, please read the first paragraphs of the Assayer, only read 3 or 4. It's like wow, if Galileo was on Twitter, that would be a storm. I mean, you'll see. That's how this starts. I'll just jump, but you have a sense. So that's the first thing I want to tell you now, following the order. Galileo started by saying, I've never understood, Your Excellency, why it is that every one of the studies I have published in order to please or to serve other people has aroused in some men, a certain perverse urge to detract, steal, or deprecate that modicum of merit which I thought I had earned, if not for my work, at least for its intention. You see already the rhetorics? But, it started with a complaint. It's not like an abstract, here we find that the comets and this is the data, and no, it's like, and then he continues, immediately the entire press was filled with attacks against my discourse. He's talking about previous books. I jump ahead, he says, how many men attacked my letters on sunspots? Under what disguises? He continues, these are only the first pages of the abridged translation, of course. After such clear proofs of these, there was no longer any room for doubt in my mind about this ill feeling and stubborn opposition that existed against my works. Okay, you come across this for a third time, but Galileo goes on and on and on, like poor Cesarini, right? He has to put up with all these feelings, but so you see the temperament of the man. So this is not like a detached, abstracted science that has nothing to do with the scientist, like scientists expressing here all these betrayers, right? By remaining silent, I could not evade the stubborn fate of having to concern myself continually with men who write against me and quarrel with me. Another quote. Okay. During the entire time the comet was visible, I was confined by illness to my bed. This is an interesting part of the story, because then somebody else is from his team, and it's not that he had a lab, like a collaborator wrote a piece that then Sarsi critiques as if it was Galileo who had said it. So this is already entangled part of the soap opera. So here Galileo is defending himself against accusations on previous books, and with respect to the comments, against accusations of Sarsi, of a colleague of Galileo that was called Giuduzzi, who had written something while Galileo was ill, right? Okay. I think enough for this about the style of the book. And honestly, the entire Italian version gets a bit tedious, but you need to have this sense of how he needs all these lines to express that. Okay. Second important part. Then, unexpectedly, he makes quite at the beginning this quote about math. I'll read it in English, and then James, you can read it in Italian, and then we can discuss it a little bit. So this is what Galileo says, and I'll start a bit above. In Sarsi, I seem to discern the firm belief that in philosophizing one must support oneself upon the opinion of some celebrated author, as if our minds ought to remain completely sterile and barren unless wed to the reasoning of some other person. And that has to do more with the method and with the epistemic humility and with not appealing to authority but experience. But then Galileo says, possibly he thinks that philosophy is a book of fiction by some writer. Interesting analogy here with the book. Like the Iliad or Orlando Furioso, productions in which the least important thing is whether what is written there is true. Well, Sarsi, that is not how matters stand. And then it comes. Philosophy is written in this grand book, the universe, which stands continuously open to our gaze. But the book cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which it is composed. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one wanders about in a dark labyrinth. Okay, James.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So let's read the Italian. Signor Sarsi, la cosa non sta così. La filosofia è scritta in questo grandissimo libro che continuamente ci sta aperto innanzi agli occhi. Io dico l'universo. Ma non si può intendere se prima non si impara a intendere la lingua, a conoscere i caratteri nei quali è scritto. Egli è scritto in lingua matematica, e i caratteri sono triangoli, cerchi e altre figure geometriche senza i quali mezzi è impossibile a intenderne umanamente parola. Senza questi è un aggirarsi vanamente per un oscuro labirinto. Which is, I mean, the Italian is quite beautiful. It's almost like reading poetry. Like, obviously it is an old Italian.
You froze a little bit there, James. Yeah, you're still frozen, at least as I see it. You're back.
So, am I back now?
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that.
You were saying it's beautiful, almost poetic.
Very poetic, very poetic. I mean, I just love the beginning. La filosofia è scritta in questo grandissimo libro che continuamente ci sta aperto. The philosophy is written in this huge book that is always open to our eyes. That would just, I mean, it just means that it's accessible. It's not some mystery that only God has. So that is only available to God. It's available to all of us, as long as you know the characters and the language, which is mathematics. That to me is what comes out from this this quote.
I think it's important that we hear it in Italian. And one thing to mention here is that I thought that this work had been written in Latin, because Latin was the English of science today. Like today, if you write a piece of science, you write it in English, and philosophy, and natural philosophy was written in Latin. But there's well, as always in history, there are all these funny anecdotes that apparently Galileo had written his first book in Latin, and it had such a backslash from the academics, from the philosophers, and that he decided, maybe I'm putting too many words in his mouth, but he said, okay, I just won't write for these people. They just don't get it. So I'll write in Italian, and at least like the lay people or other people will understand it. So it won't go through the path of, stubborn dogmatic academics. And so many of the books he wrote later, not all of them, but most of them are written in Italian, including Il Saggiatore. So that's one thing. And you emphasize the eyes, James. And this is perhaps something I wanted to mention when we speak about consciousness and what this method is. But there's a primacy, and it's natural, but let's emphasize it, about the senses. Let's think there are 5 senses at least. But out of these 5, vision seems to be traveling in first class. But smell and taste, you see, and well, maybe hearing, second class, and taste and smell is third class. And this is important here, like also when he says, be in the dark, like in a labyrinth, right? You're not seeing, it's open to our eyes. That's when we're reading the book. And even the word telescope or microscope, it's about expanding our visual scope. So here's a note to make about also a hierarchy of senses that starts becoming more prominent here. Yes. Okay. I think we can, well, I had mentioned before this irony of the languages, right? And how, well, for biologists, maybe it's not math anymore. For theoretical physicists, it's still math. For biologists, is, well, a sequence of nucleotides and so on. And the second point about language is, as many philosophers have said, language is used both to reveal and to conceal. So we could criticize Galileo here with humility saying, sure, with maths, you get all these secrets revealed, but you get others concealed probably, right? And that's why we need poets, and that's why we need silence if we get a bit mystical here. And that's why we need art and music. So see, again, there's a hierarchy, and the eye is put at the top, math is put at the top. It has served us well for 400 years. But in thinking about the future scientists, maybe we need to go back to the future and say, well, maybe or maybe not so much. Yeah. And also, James, because you mentioned emphasize that in this quote, it seems like this book, nature, is open to us. This is not what I'm going to say. It's not a major quote out of the 3 main ones, but later on, Galileo says something. Maybe we don't need to go and read it exactly in English or Italian. He says something like that. In a way, nature is deaf to what we want, and this has also percolated. I mean, this is like meeting somebody and then meeting their parents and then saying, "Oh, I get it." You see what I mean? Like when you see many of the current habits we have, not just in academia, like because we're West. I mean, we, this is global, but at least those of us who come from the West, it's so influenced by this kind of thinking. Well, this idea of, well, the universe doesn't care about us, it's like nature is deaf. And I know why Galileo is saying it. It's like, well, it's not what we want. I mean, you can see it in many of these prominent science communicators, right? Like, science doesn't care about what you think, and that's the great thing about it. Well, yes, it means that it's not, you need to be confronted with reality, and then there's a feedback loop of correction. But it's too much to say, I suppose, that, well, therefore, we are separate from nature and so on. And you can see where this could lead us. So this is a quote we find in this book later, that Galileo says that, well, nature is, he also says something beautiful that I already read, that nature's bounty, right, when we look for it, well, sometimes it will take us a lot of effort and just use the senses and reason and so on to get it, but also in a way, nature doesn't care too much if we do it. And this is debatable. Like other scientists like Goethe who disagree. Then there are harsher versions of Galileo, which could be Francis Bacon around the same time, actually 1620, I think. This famous, kind of misquoted, but the idea is correct, like this famous idea of, well, we should torture nature. He didn't say torture, but he said pursue her to the rack. And it sounds like what you're thinking about. Well, so you can see a gradient here of our relationship with nature. Okay, maybe I'm saying too much about that. So Il Saggiatore, we saw kind of the Twitter-like, I'm so fed up with how they're treating my work. Then this quote about math just dropped there, amazing. And then if we continue reading selectively, we
Àlex,
can start. Yes.
Somebody asks if you can state the page number that you're reading.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, and I have it's a big mess because I have the Drake pages, the Italian version pages, and yes. So I suppose people want the English. Yes. All right. So let me rewind. Okay. When I spoke about the soap opera, like, this is as long as you start the Drake translation, the first page, second page, it's all over. Yeah, very good. It's page 4, and you see in Drake there it's a double page. So it's page 4, the left hand side. That's where we find the quote about mathematics. Page 4. Yeah, please wait until page 4 and you'll find it. Yes, but remind me if I don't say it, because it took me some time also to map the pages. Page 4, left side, the maths quote. Then it starts to talk about the method, and that's why it's so fascinating. In trying to clarify this debate about the comets, he starts making some quotes. Well, saying some things that I'll read that are very interesting about the relationship between scientists. And the word scientist hadn't been invented, of course, but those who are trying to sort out things. So let me read some selected quotes here. Perhaps Sarsi believes that he may have had nightmares with Sarsi. It's like Sarsi. By the way, Sarsi was a pseudonym. I said it at the beginning, right? He also complains at the beginning, why is he hiding in anonymity? It reminded me of Twitter as well, when you're discussing with, ultra-fast X 1984, it's like, why don't you have your real name there? So he's also pissed off that Sarsi is not telling who he is. So he writes, perhaps Sarsi believes that all the host of good philosophers may be enclosed within 4 walls. I believe that they fly, and that they fly alone like eagles and not in flocks like starlings. You see so in group, like all these starlings. No. We should look at the eagles. It is true that because eagles are rare birds, they are little seen and less heard. See, not many followers, not many citations. While birds that fly like starlings fill the sky with shrieks and cries, and wherever they're settled, befall the earth beneath them. And then he speaks about the third kind of bird, the phoenix. So that's good enough, but it's very evocative. Then more quotes, and this continues here. I'm in page 5, left side, and then the right side. To put aside hints and speak plainly, I'm dealing with science as a method of demonstration and reasoning capable of human pursuit. I hold that the more this partakes of perception, the smaller the number of propositions it will promise to teach, and fewer yet will it conclusively prove. You see the humility here, and also the ambition. Consequently, the more perfect it is, the less attractive it will be, and the fewer its followers. Later on, hence, I consider it not very sound to judge a man's philosophical opinions by the number of his followers. He says that literally, you know. This is also a hallmark of science as it's taught, right? Like, it doesn't matter if everybody agrees. Science is a very special kind of consensus. We've discussed this before, but it's not a consensus in the sense, okay, 1,000 million people think that. Well, one can come in principle and just be right against all odds, right? So it doesn't depend on the number of followers. And when Galileo is writing this is not that trivial as we would consider today, because it was more about appeal to authority and how well have you read the other philosophers, who of course were no idiots, by the way, and probably they were the eagles and even the phoenix that he's talking about. And then there's another part here that's interesting, talking about Sarsi. He said, well, I do not know, for I have not studied their work sufficiently to judge. So that's also fine when you say, well, it can also be a rhetorical weapon, you know, when you ask to comment on something, it's like, well, I didn't have the time to read your work. But, well, that's also fair to say. Now I move to page 6, left hand side, towards the end of this long paragraph. He says, the correct reply, which would be, I don't know. So here if we read from the father of science, I don't know. That reply is as much more tolerable than the others as candid honesty is more beautiful than deceitful duplicity. Okay, then the Assayer continues. Galileo talks about the telescope, of course, it's very important. The telescope, how it works, it defends itself about his invention, which is not really his invention, but it's the way he set it up and the way he used it. And it reminded me of Santiago Ramón y Cajal, a Spanish neuroscientist who won the Nobel Prize. We only have one of these. And he improved his method to look through the microscope in that case, not the telescope. And he could see similar things as Golgi, an Italian, by the way, and they both got, Cajal and Golgi got the Nobel Prize. And also there's an interesting fight, because in the Nobel speech, Golgi kind of critique Cajal, like stab him on the back, and Cajal wasn't ready. You know, science is always like that. In any case, it's talking about the instrument and how to make use of the instrument. And also it's very interesting, and we don't have time to talk about that. The other things that I read that Galileo had done, like, you know, look through the telescope, see the moon, see that it has craters because there are shadows, and say, well, it doesn't look like this perfect, you know, Platonic object, and so forth. And then you wonder, at least I wonder, well, didn't other people have this technology of the time? Why weren't they seeing what Galileo saw? Why didn't they decide to just point the telescope to the moon and realize, look, there seem to be some things, I see them high resolution. They look like mountains. Maybe the moon is like the Earth. So this is a good moment perhaps to read you here a paragraph that didn't make it into the review, when I compressed all the other contributions of Galileo. Before this quarrel, Galileo had produced several major works on a wide range of topics. Uniform and naturally accelerated motion. I mean, this is key, and no time to talk about. The military compass. Floating bodies. Tides, the mountains of the moon, the phases of Venus, the moons of Jupiter, the rings of Saturn, sunspots. Again, you look at the sun. Oh, there's a little here in the skin. It doesn't look like such a perfect celestial object, right? Sunspots and invisible stars, of course, that couldn't be seen before, which would take us into all the relationship between the visible and the invisible, and physics as the business of making the invisible visible, and so on. And then after the Assayer, he wrote 2 more books, briefly known as Dialogo, 1632, and Discorsi, 1638. This is the book that triggered the punishment. As one of his books, yeah, and this continues. Okay, so in the Assayer, then we find all of these about the telescope, the instrument, and a lot about the comets, the actual rebuttal, which is a bit confusing, because it's not that Galileo said that these things in the sky, especially one of them, which was the biggest, supposedly, were visual illusions. But he's saying, hey, Sarsi, not so fast. You're saying these are objects. And when I look through them, I wouldn't be sure, because there's so many things to have in. So Galileo here is super prudent, right? Saying, well, But Sarsi was right. They were physical objects. So this is another kind of footnote to reflect on. Great scientists can make great mistakes. And he can write this book, which we're celebrating today, and just got the main thesis wrong against his opponent. But look how many gifts in the way. And Einstein also had his famous greatest blunder, and so on. Darwin also made some celebrated mistakes. That's fine. Okay, so the book continues, and I'm skipping the meat because it's actually the bread. Because yes, no, you see, they're spurious, they're not. All right, and then let's see. I have this map. We go to the telescope, the rebuttal. Yes, then we arrive at the nature, the quote about nature that I already mentioned, right? There's this bounty, and maybe we can access some of it, but in a way, nature doesn't care about us. Then later on in the book, Galileo speaks about friction and heat, and this is another nugget because he seems to indicate some sort of molecular theory of heat, which wouldn't happen until what, 300 years later? No, 200 years later, right? Or 200 or 300. So speaking about heat and friction and what Galileo would consider friction, and whether these comets are just he speaks a lot about light. So this is another thing what could unpack from it, but we won't stop there. And then towards the end, he makes the consciousness quote. So I'll go there. It's really towards the end. There are many things I'm skipping ahead here. Okay, so I'm now in page 21, right-hand side of the Breed's translation. And he says, and now I'll ask James to read also the consciousness quote, because this is another highlight. Sarsi goes on to say that since this experience of Aristotle's has failed to convince us, many other great men also have written things of the same sort. To this I reply that if, in order to refute Aristotle's statement, we are obliged to represent that no other men have believed it, then nobody on earth can ever refute it, since nothing can make those who have believed it not believe it. So this has to do more with the epistemology. But then again, as a surprise, like the math quote, he drops this. But it is news to me. Okay, sorry, this is also about the authority. But it is news to me that any man would actually put the testimony of writers ahead of what experience shows him. To adduce more witnesses serves no purpose, Sarsi, for we have never denied that such things have been written and believed. We did say they are false, but so far as authority is concerned, yours alone is as effective as an army's in rendering the events true or false. Sorry, this is still about, it doesn't matter how many people say so, you must go back to experience and experiment. Okay, now really I want to apply to the consciousness quote, which is in 21b. No, sorry, 23. This is a bit. Yes, here it is. Okay, 23b. Hence, I think that tastes, odors, colors, and so on are no more than mere names so far as the object in which we place them is concerned, and that they reside only in consciousness. The word consciousness here we'll hear, it's not consciousness in Italian, and this is perhaps important, but I just mentioned it here. Hence, if the living creature were removed, all these qualities will be wiped away and annihilated. And then later on, and I'll hand it over to you, James, he says, qualities residing in external objects have no real existence save in us. And then later on, a couple of pages later, this is already page 25. If we go to page 24, along the same lines, he says, to excite in us tastes, odors, and sounds, I believe that nothing is required in external bodies except shapes, numbers, and slow or rapid movements. You see, so the real thing is numbers, the shape, and how fast they move. This is actually what physics has been about for many, many years. I think that if ears, tongues, and noses, and you see here, ears, tongues, and noses. Okay, what happens if these were removed? Shapes and numbers and motions would remain, but odors and tastes or sounds would not. I would ask him, well, what about if your eyes and your touch was removed and you could not tell the shape of an object or how fast it's impacting you? but you see there's a hierarchy of senses. Okay, back to you, James, to enjoy the Italian quote on consciousness.
Thank you, Alex. So the Italian goes, per lo che vuoi io, pensando che questi sapori, odori, colori, eccetera, per la parte del soggetto nel quale ci par che riseggiano, non siano altro che puri nomi, ma tengono solamente loro residenza nel corpo sensitivo, sì che rimosso l'animale. Siano elevate, annichilate tutte queste qualità. Tutta volta però che noi, sì come gli abbiamo imposti nomi particolari e differenti da quello che gli altri primi e reali accidenti, volessimo credere che essa ancora fossero veramente e realmente da quelle diverse.
How does that sound?
This is actually the most difficult to read of the presenting. Like it's using quite antiquated wordings. But yes, I mean, what is interesting here is that, you know, they return to empiricism. Like, you know, the fact that he's naming, you know, odori, colori, sapori, actually naming the 5 senses and saying, you know, these are, yes, well, just names, but this is again, a map that we need to use to navigate the big book of philosophy in nature.
Why do you think Drake translated Corpos Sensitivo with the word consciousness? I mean, I don't know, and we're just guessing here, but it's so remarkable.
Yes, so I mean, even in Italian, yes, it is Corpos Sensitivo.
Would you say Corpos Sensitivo today to refer to anything? How else could you translate it? If you would translate Corpus Sensitivo, what would you say in English?
Yeah, the sensitive body. That's how I would. But like sensitive as in a feel, like a touch, not as in, you know, I'm feeling very sensitive today.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, empirical, sensitive as in the senses.
Yeah. So this looks like job for the phenomenologist who came in the 20th century and said, well, you see the embodied feeling and also taking experience as primary rather than as something that you can imagine not being there when you're not there, but still you're imagining this from your own consciousness or experience, if you will, right? So this is precisely the reversal that consciousness science, well, not the status quo, the mainstream, but some consciousness scientists are trying to do. And so that's why I pointed attention to this word, corpus sensitivo. Sure, without our corpus sensitivo, it seems we are not, but as I said before, not even sight or touch. But anyways, kudos for Galileo. And this, as I said, was then expanded by Locke and many other philosophers. And it's, even to bring it further, then it also have to do with the Cartesian split, which I tend to think as a divorce. I explained like this. It's a bit of a simplification, but the Cartesian split and this split is like a divorce. When you say, okay, I'll take care of this and you'll take care of that, which is I'll take care of the body and the motion and shape and what can be measured. And then the church will continue to take care of the soul and salvation and so on, and maybe subjective experience. But then years go by, and I don't want to make any reference to what's going on today, but then boundaries go back and forth and back and forth. And there's constantly a war as to this separation that's been done. And this is the Cartesian split, and this is this Galilean knot as well. And how to solve it is really complicated. Okay, there are more quotes, there are more things we could talk about, there are more historical anecdotes. Perhaps one more. I'll say one more thing, and I think I'll pass it to you, James, in case you want to make some further comments, and then we can start the discussion with the rest. About the title, because it's also interesting. The title, Il Saggiatore, and we could even go and find the quote, or you can tell us about the Italian, but the Assayer has to do also with kind of the fine way of weighing metals versus Libra, which was the book that Sarsi, the pseudonym Sarsi, had published. And Libra is more like a coarse device to measure things. So even with the title, Galileo is saying, well, this is the coarse way of thinking about it, libera et astronoma philosophare, whatever, and this is il saggiatore, which is like the fine way of weighing all this controversy about whether the natures are there or not. So this is emphasized and hidden in the title. All right, James. We agreed I would do most of the talking, but it's really, James and I had been discussing this, and I felt I'm so grateful that you took the time to read what we exchanged and read it in Italian. And so, any other comments you want to make, James?
Yes. Well, I mean, well, thank you, Àlex, for inviting me to this space. Maybe one thing I would like to mention, it's a bit of a shame where we missed not that last third quote on authority, just because I feel like that's at the end of the day what Galileo wanted to say. So the quote basically says, you can have 100 people behind you, but that means nothing if it's not backed by science, reason, etc. And I think that's basically what he's trying to say, because at that time, there was this sort of philosophy, which was the ipse dixit, which is Latin for he said, and usually referred back to Aristotle. Well, if Aristotle said it, then it must be true, and that's what we must follow. And what Galileo said in the two quotes that we read and his comments on authority is, it doesn't matter how many people follow the word, if it's not true, if it's not backed by empiricism, senses, scientific, what ends up being the scientific method, it has no value. And it was interesting, someone in the comments, when we were talking about authority, AP Simmons said, like numbers of followers or a number of citations in respectable journals. And we mentioned Twitter as well. If we want to look at the news, we want to verify if that source is reliable. One of the first things we look at is how many followers it's got, how many people they follow. So we're back in this age where if certain outlets say something, then we believe it to be true. But what Galileo says, no, follow your own reason, your own research, and see if the conclusion is the same.
Yes. And yet he's friends with Cesare, who is the interface to the Pope, and he writes the letter to the Pope, and he tries to be friends, and he tries to not, if that's another part, a great part of the Galileo story with respect to to Copernicus and all the rest, and Kepler who comes, and how to say everything, well, not lie, but not say everything, and how to point to also make some tricks and say, well, I'm saying this, but this is consistent with the other authority. So at the same time, he's saying no appeal to authority. He's very mindful of the games he needs to play. So it's a strange combination of being kind of a solid in your beliefs, but also a maverick and also knowing influential people. And that's why he writes it. This is a letter, actually. This can you imagine? This is a letter. Remind you, this is not a book like chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. This is a freaking letter of 280 pages to this poor man who's the Chamberlain of the Pope, right?
And that's it. He's saying everything about authority. However, this letter book is dedicated to the Pope.
Yes.
Still has some sort of an appeal to authority. And even in the opening letter, the dedication, he doesn't sign it as himself, but he signs it as sort of the whole scientific community is behind him in this. So he elevates himself as well as an authority in this.
Indeed. Wonderful. All right. Well, I think we did some homework today, and we're ready to just talk about whatever you want, and we'll be ready for part 2 and part 3, because there'll be more Galileo today and in the future. Yes. So we open it up for comments and questions.
Yes, if you do want to come in, you can use the raise your hand function, which is under reactions at the bottom of your screen, or physically raise your hand. If I can see, I'll spot you and call you out, or even write it in the chat, and I can read it out for you if you feel more comfortable. Veronica, would you like to come in?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to both of you for the beautiful readings and all the energy that you are putting into this. I have two sort of very quick questions. The quote about nature, don't you think that the dilemma today is precisely would have to be with a revision of our philosophy, the nature of philosophy that has been so intellectualized, and that keeps at least a group of philosophers who are very intellectuals are sort of ignoring science, when actually the scientists are starting to philosophize in the best sense of the term, in the way Galileo would have. And the second question, I'm sorry, it's a little pushing it, but I can't help thinking the quote letter, 280 pages to the Pope. What would be the equivalent today? I live in Washington, D.C., and I happen to be able to attend the congressional hearings on the UAPs. And I know, I mean, this sounds very almost stupid, but I think like it's so, I can't help but comparing what these people are trying to do with writing to the Pope. So what would be an equivalent of such an accomplishment?
Yes.
You have to answer that if you don't want to.
I do. James, you want to start?
Oh no, maybe just a quick comment for the first question. Of course, back in the day, philosophy and science were the same thing. It was called Filosofia Naturale, natural philosophy. So it all encompassed everything. Discovering, parts of what we would today call science at the time was a way of understanding nature as a whole, but even philosophically. So the fact that today the scientists are doing philosophy, it's sort of circling back to that original idea of what natural philosophy is, which I think is very important. Otherwise, science gets too dry and materialistic, I would say.
So does philosophy.
Yes. I don't know about the second question. Maybe it might still be the Pope.
Well, I can enter now. I think the Pope now is within science and distributed. It's like a mycelial network that just, and this is also natural. I mean, it's no big surprise. Like in all societies or endeavors, there's more a conservative aspect and a more creative one that wants to. But science is, and the sensor is done from within. It's not like the scientist and then there's somebody from within. We censor ourselves. You only need to look at the consciousness wars going on today. I don't know if this may be too local to talk about, and I'm not even talking about the edges of consciousness, those who know what we've been working in Paris in the summer, not the edges, just consciousness. And recently there's all sorts of stabbing for funding, for notoriety, and when maybe the little popes who are the editors of journals, because they decide, as they should as editors, but they decide whether your work even goes to other people to be reviewed, right? As this famous complaint by Einstein saying, who are you to even review my work? Maybe that's too much. But so we do the self-censoring from within. And again, it has a dark side and a luminous side, because that's one of the powers of science, that it's, in theory and in practice as well, self-correcting. But the self-correction can be also self-censoring, where, new ideas are not welcome for very mundane reasons, because that's not what I've been doing for the last 30 years. In case of consciousness studies, let me say, there's only one main theory who's hardcore mathematical, which is integrated information theory. So I would guess that most of the people in consciousness studies don't get it because they cannot read the language the book is written on, because they don't know maths. So that can be one reason to self-censor, to say, well, that's rubbish. Or your metaphysical priors. Some theories are less materialistic and more towards idealism or panpsychism. Well, scientists don't like it. So self-censoring. So the Pope is many minion popes within science today. And then we could talk about other layers, like political layers, and because also scientists go and lobby, for instance, in Europe, so that they get this project or this other project. Another big one was the Human Brain Project that ended this year, 10 years, lots of money, a lot of overpromising, a lot of under-delivering. It's true. And that also had to do with the politics of it. So it's not just that science is isolated from political pressures. But to answer your question, I think the letter to the Pope, now it's the letter to the editor, and it's all the mingling you do in conferences so that they make your life easy, or at least they don't make it impossible. Because there are some ideas that are just impossible to even get a logical critique against. That's for the first question. Second question, for the first one, I want to pick these books. This is an incredible book. It's in Spanish, but by Pierre Hadot, The Veil of Isis.
Oh, yes, Pierre Hadot, yes.
And
yes,
is how do we think about nature?
yes.
And it's similar in the sense of deciphering, but he's, and this is worth how many pages? 400 pages of talk about this piece by Heraclitus, Nature Loves to Hide, and what it means that it hides, and how do we discover it. And this is another one, a critique, right? A feminist critique of this kind of dominant approach of making her speak the secrets as opposed to seducing or inviting her to share what's going on. So this is a very important question you asked, the relationship between nature and scientist.
Yeah. Thank you for Pierre Hadot. I like him a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Veronica.
Next we have Raymond. Hi, Raymond.
Hello. Thank you very much, James and Alex, for a wonderful talk. I just wanted to make two comments about the idea of the book of the universe and the language of mathematics. I'm listening and I'm thinking of a student going for his university interview today, and he tells the dean, well, I'd like to become study financial services and become a hedge fund manager. And the dean would say, oh, that's wonderful. And when you become wealthy, don't forget to be a donor to the university. And then I think of Galileo going in and saying, well, I'd like to read and interpret the book of the universe. And the dean might be referring him to the school psychotherapist rather than realizing this might be the true purpose of why we would want to go to university in the first place. And the other thing I just want to mention about language, because I started thinking about the different languages by which we interpret the book of the universe. And your comment about going back to the future reminds me of a definition of romanticism as we go back in order to go forward. And so I started to think about the 9 Greek muses and what they were muses for. 4 of them were for poetry. There was 1 for music, 1 for tragedy, 1 for dance, 1 for history. There were no mathematicians, there were no painters or sculptors, but the final muse was the muse of astronomy. So there's different languages by which we can approach this book of the universe. And if there's any, I guess, mistake to positivism or the materialist view is to think that mathematics is the only language by which we could approach this incredible book.
Thank you. These are complex questions, Raymond. Do you wanna address any of those, James, or should I? Okay, I can speak a bit more about first the universities. I mean, don't fire up my political activism here, but yes, how interesting the universe is written in the book of, well, the universes are written in the book of the accountants and the bureaucrats, right? Because it's a business. It's, you know, and especially in the US, luckily in Spain, we don't have to pay it back for years, but I have friends in the US and you know how it works, right? Money making. And universities are not about universitas either. It's so specialized. Also makes sense because knowledge has exploded. But yes, we go to university. I can already see it. I've mentioned this before in some of the students, not all, perhaps most, PhD students, for instance. Here you have 4 years in theory to just learn and wonder and you know, study. It's like what we do in Paris, this new learning. Just get it in. First year, end of first year, they already act like papa and mama. You see, they have these committees, they're crafting their CV, which makes sense because the selection pressure shapes the landscape, right? They know what this is about. I also had for instance, not PhDs, I also have had, or let's say somebody had a postdoc who came to work and he said, look, I've realized this is a scam. And I could be making much more money in a bank. So why bother? I'm leaving, you see. So yes, that's what's going on today. As with respect to languages, let's leave aside mathematics versus this. Let's just speak about languages, literally languages. Like there are things in English, and well, here we were translating, like Corpos Sensitivo and consciousness. There are expressions we're lost in translation, even between languages. Like if you try to translate poetry from one language to any other, you know it's a betrayal. It's said, right? The job of the translation is this kind of betrayal. To speak about consciousness studies, I have hard traveling translating to Spanish, and maybe somebody can help me, or to Italian even. The way in which most Americans, the academic Americans, say what consciousness is, based on Thomas Nagel's piece about what it is like to be a bat. Consciousness, it is what it is like to be, well, it's really hard to translate even that to Spanish, right? So we're constantly lost in translation. And I suppose we should, instead of emphasizing this kind of little monotheism of what my language being mathematics or being English or being German, by the way, that's why German philosophy can be so nuanced, apparently. And that's why Portuguese sounds like music to my ears, I suppose. Well, instead of emphasizing, well, no, it's either mathematical or it's not, to just see all these languages as phases of this polyhedric object and say, well, with this one, I can project this part, but I'm not going to turn this into a God and say, well, that's the real language in which it speaks. And then we could treat nature more as what it is, right? And there's also a beautiful idea, maybe by the quantum physicists, but also by some philosophers that say, I love that. Not sure if it's true, but it's lovely, that nature replies to you in the language you address her. That's fantastic. It's not like, so it's like, it's nature an English speaker, is nature a mathematical speaker? No. How you address her, it will speak back to you, not only in language, but also in tone, going back to whether you're asking her to whisper, to spit out secrets, or to sing them, you see? So this is a fascinating idea. And you mentioned going back to the future and romanticism. Yes, going back, because for new things, we need to go to old things, because it's been said before. And I mentioned Goethe, we could mention von Humboldt, and these guys, they may or may not know maths, but they would go and they would spend, Darwin himself would spend hours looking how plants grow, for instance, and draw them, like there was an intimation with the object they were studying. And so this object-subject separation was not as harsh as they make us believe it should be as a scientist. About the muses, I don't know what to say, really.
Well, thank you, Raymond, for your comment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is it Gina? Did you want to come in?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much to both of you, Àlex and James. I don't speak very good Italian at all, but when you read the original in the Italian, it made sense. It was beautiful. Anyhow, I've been working in a little bit of a vacuum. I'm speaking to you from a community by Edmonton, Alberta. I live in St. Albert in Canada. In 1989, I wrote a play. I'm a playwright, but now I'm an independent filmmaker. I wrote a play called Physics for Poets, and it's about one night. It's about the night that Galileo is preparing to travel from Florence to Rome to appear in front of the Inquisitional Council, those fun guys. And in the night that he's preparing to travel to Rome, he's visited by 4 people. He's attended to by his daughter, Sister Maria Celeste. Viviani comes to visit. Torricelli comes to visit. And they're encouraging Galileo to get some rest before his journey. Sister Maria, we know, is the apothecarist, and we're not sure what she slipped into his wine to get him to drink, but he does fall asleep. And he has another visitor, or 4th visitor, Johann Kepler, who this time is dead, but Johann Kepler has a question. And it's an important question that I might even ask of both of you is, why didn't you answer my letters? Right? We know that historically Galileo did not answer Kepler's letters. Anyhow, the play is basically about the more technology we have, the more philosophy we need. Here, technology as an offshoot of science. Like I say, I've been in a bit of a vacuum here. I wrote the play in 1989, trotted it around to theater companies internationally. It was well received, never produced. It was treated as a bit of a closet drama. The very, very few history of science professors on the planet liked it. So it had a life as a closet drama. Now, out of the blue, 2023, this wonderful event that you've got today is lifeblood. It's mother's milk to me. Physics for Poets. How did I get that title? The very reasons that you've articulated in Stillman Drake's brilliant translation. By the way, I was at a conference once. Stillman Drake was present, and I was a fairly young woman at the time, and I was reading Arthur Koestler, Sleepwalkers. I don't know if you're familiar. An interesting view on Kepler. And when he saw the book in my hand, he wound up spending the better part of a day with me, convincing, no, I should not be reading the works of Koestler, and why his Stillman Drake's works were the ones that I should rely on. I'll never forget that opportunity. Listen, I could go on and on here, but I'm just saying that the integration of the work that I've been doing, by the way, I did get a grant. Physics for Poets is going to live as a film. We had a wonderful reading of the script at the TELUS World of Science here in Edmonton, one of the larger science centers we have on the planet. It will proceed with production in May. We're shooting in May, the play. I had the opportunity to travel to Florence. I met with Dr. Giorgio Stranos at the Galileo Museum. I'm pleased to say he liked my work. So I'm really hoping to connect with people from your fabulous organization. We really are interconnected. The interdisciplinary nature of the proceedings that I've heard today, I think puts you in good stead. And I know there's many people who would like to ask questions. And I think I've talked. I haven't really asked you questions. I've just been so excited to meet up with people of like mind. Thank you. Mille grazie so much for this opportunity. And I'm looking forward to ongoing presentations. I hope we can connect someday.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
So when the film is out, we'd love to see it.
Sure. If you're interested in the script, we put it through, it's been through so many rewrites, but we did a final version, which was presented in a professional reading. I can certainly, provide the script if anybody's interested in reading it.
Yes,
So-
we are. Yeah.
Or, you know, some kind of discourse, because that's what Galileo wanted, you know, was the idea, discourse. And we are of his community.
I wonder if you'd be interested in writing a sequel called Poetry for Physicists.
Yes.
Because we also need that.
Actually, I gave a presentation to the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory, which is in the Victoria, BC, Canada. And a child asked me, I think the most important question is, when are we going to put a poet in space? Yeah. And, you know, you think of the implications of that, the meaning of that. I thought it was interesting.
Well, you prompt two thoughts in me by making this remark, which is that because next week we're going to have Dean Radin, who's the chief scientist at the IONS Institute of Noetic Sciences, that was founded 50 years ago by the sixth man to go to the moon, step on the moon, Mitchell. And he went there as an engineer, and he came back, you could say, as not as a poet, but it's very interesting the reasons why they went there. And then when he was going back, he had these mystical experiences. So beware, because at any moment that may fall on you and just change your life. And that's why he founded the center and so on.
I have experienced that. I made a film. Anybody here who's listening can find it on YouTube. It's called An Astronomical Moment, where we interviewed Dr. Robert Thirsk, an astronaut. He's retired now. He's been in space, mostly ISS, more than any other Canadian. We started to interview him. I wanted to make a film about the effects of light pollution. Okay. He talked about how being in space, how being up there affected him in here and in here. We made a series of 12 one-minute films. Again, you can go on YouTube and see it. Or if anybody wants to email to get my filmography, I can provide this. So it's 12 one-minute episodes, each on a different science theme, but on the lessons he learned and some clues about how we can proceed.
Let me say something about poetry, and then we move on to the next question or comment, because you're mentioning poetry reminded me something very important. I could have said in the previous question, which is when speaking about language and all the languages that there are, from Spanish to Italian to programming languages to mathematics. Well, there's one that's a particular one, which is poetry. And poetry is akin to mantra, as they say in the East. And the particularity of mantra is that the sound and the meaning come together. So I like to think about language not just as a vehicle, this kind of, well, a word is kind of a carrier of some meaning, but it's, in a way, it doesn't really matter. We could have called it something else. And in the limit where language becomes, how to say it, so spiritual, perhaps? Well, we get poetry and we get mantra, and it's not a joke that you can repeat a mantra and that very sound, it's doing something. It's not like a meaning that we cognize and we interpret. I believe it's much more than that. So that's language at its best, poetry and mantra, I would say, and silence, perhaps.
And you said something that I think gives great hope, that nature responds to us, or indeed listens to us, no matter what language we speak to nature in. You said that earlier. Well,
the important point is that, and that she will reply in the same language we ask her. That's even more puzzling.
Which is the miracle that will indeed happen.
And that happens with that. And that happens with people, because it's not the same to say good morning than to say good morning, right? So even at a psychological level, that makes sense. Okay, well, thanks so much. It feels we could have a whole session, you and I, going back and forth. But let's pass it to James. Thank you so much for your comments.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, I'll take the last one from Shahid.
Oh, hi. Firstly, I'd like to say I really enjoyed the whole session. I've been a great fan of Galileo. But I just want to make a comment. I've done a lot of science over a long period of time. And one of the things I've noticed is that there's a large element, I think it's been sort of alluded to in your comments as well. There's a large element of what you might call social aspects of science. I think that's what Galileo was probably trying to make a major comment on. And it influences how ideas are accepted and how they're propagated. So I think it's a very important thing to be aware of. So it's just basically a comment on that. I think that was a major thing because he obviously under the problems he had with his with the prevalent ideas at the time. So I think that's what he was saying. And even going further, if you think about the social aspects of human behavior, it does rely a lot on interconnectedness and language. And that's sort of we're almost talking about that at the same time, even though we're trying to address more deeper issues about, the science itself, the physicalism and materialism. That's only a comment I want to make. Thanks.
Yes, totally. And he doesn't shy away from it, as we've discussed, spends many pages. Of course, styles change and we wouldn't do it like this, but it's worth reminding, as you say, that well, scientists are nested within something that's called human beings. And so this separation of just show me the data. I love it when my colleagues say, well, that's what the data says. I wonder if data can speak, right? Because we make it speak. It's more like a ventriloque, right? Like, well, that's what the data says, and they're doing like this. Well, it depends. It depends what you're making it say. It depends why you collected and why you didn't collect all the data. It depends on what device or machine you used. It depends how you had to pitch the entire story. So maybe a last comment here, talking about language and text. Well, there's text and the literality of text, but then there's context, and then there's subtext, and then there is pretext. And it's so naive, even pernicious to pretend that there's only text in the language, because we all know when we read anything and the same word can mean different things. And actually, I have a good friend of mine who's an author, a very prolific author, and he says that one of the not even the tricks, like the goals of writing well, is to leave enough space for people, for the other person, actually for the reader, to be able to just participate, right? Which is perhaps the opposite of a mathematical proof. Mathematical proof, again, thinking in terms of a gradient of languages, is a chain, and it has a good reason to be a chain. You can use a chain to be chained or maybe not to fall from a precipice. But a mathematical formalism is, okay, you have an assumption, and then this follows, this follows, this follows. And as a reader, if the proof is correct, you have no option. You start here, you end there. A novel is completely the opposite. Well, it's not the opposite, but it plays another game. It's you start here, but there are all these interstices where you project, you imagine, you remember. And so very interesting related to your sociological comment. It's not just the text. It's not just the data files. It's the context, the pretext, the subtext. Everything makes the book, if you wish. Yes, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you
so much. Yeah, so I guess we have reached the end of this session.
Yes.
You know what I'm going to say, Alex? Do you have any final comments to close the session?
Well, no. I think I've spoken a lot. Just that I always say no and then say something. Repeat, this is a celebration, and this is an invitation, and this has been a preparation to better enjoy what we will discuss next Wednesday and the following Tuesday. And be mindful of the times, because the events change time, and also some light changing in different countries done messed up the times. But see you there next week to have this really great men, Avi Loeb and Dean Radin, and see how can they both speak about inner and outer spaces today. Yes, and thank you, James, for doing this and backing me up with the Italian. And it's, as somebody said, it's really important to hear it. So we heard Galileo, his own words in his own language through you. Thank you so much, James.
Well, thank you. No, I mean, it's I'm extremely grateful that you invited me to help you out and read Galileo's own words. You know, Galileo is one of the heroes and legends of Italian history and science history as well. So it's it's important that we celebrate him, and it's been great to be a part of it.
Yeah.
And of course, thank you for everyone who joined us today, whether you were listening, contributing in the chat, or asking your questions. Yes, as Àlex mentioned, the next session of this series will be on Wednesday, October 25th at 1 o'clock. Well, 6 o'clock British time, 7 o'clock Spanish Italian time. And we will have Avi Loeb and Dean Radin and Àlex talking about exploring outer and inner spaces. And then the third session will be on Tuesday, October 31st at
today's time at 6 p.m. today in Italy. Yes.
Where we will have David Lorimer, Marjorie Woolacott, and Athena Bottari talking about expanding the scope of science with the Galileo Commission. So hope to see you then. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you so much, Àlex. And we'll see you
Yes.
here
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Ciao,
Thank you,
ciao.
Alex. Thank you, James. Thank you, everybody.